Who do you think you are? Officer Rorick growled, his hand cracking across the black man's face in open court. He didn't see a Marine colonel with a chest full of medals. He saw a problem. A fatal miscalculation. The sound was sharp, ugly. It sliced through the stale air of the Charleston juvenile courtroom, louder than any gavel. Officer Calvin Rorick stood with his hand still raised, a smirk twisting his lips. Across from him, Colonel Marcus Thorne didn't move. Not a flinch. The 60-year-old retired Marine, dressed in a simple but well-kept tweed jacket, absorbed the impact as if it were a distant mortar explosion, noted, assessed, but ultimately beneath his reaction threshold. He was here for the boy, Leo, the son of his fallen brother-in-arms, Sergeant Evans. Leo was huddled at the defendant's table, a scared 17-year-old swallowed by an oversized orange jumpsuit. Rorick had been swaggering around the courtroom all morning, the undisputed king of this small, sad kingdom. But Thorne's presence had unsettled him. It wasn't disrespect, it was the opposite. It was the quiet, unwavering gaze of a man who had commanded battalions, a gaze that assessed everything and everyone with unnerving stillness. It was a gaze that didn't recognize Rorick's authority as absolute. "You got a problem, old man." Rorick had baited him, stepping close, invading his space. "Staring at me like that. You think you're better than me?" Thorne had remained silent, his back straight, his posture a silent testament to a lifetime of discipline. For Rorick, this quiet dignity was the ultimate provocation. He couldn't dominate it, so he chose to defile it. He slapped him. The courtroom froze. The public defender's jaw went slack. The judge, a man accustomed to procedural droning, looked up, his eyes wide with shock. Leo stared, his fear momentarily replaced by disbelief. They all expected an outburst, a shout, a cry of injustice. They got nothing. Thorne's eyes, dark and steady, remained locked on Rorick. They weren't angry. They were analytical. In that single, violent moment, Rorick had ceased to be a man. He had become a target. A tactical problem to be dismantled. The officer's smirk began to falter, replaced by a flicker of confusion. The silence that followed the slap was more terrifying than any scream. It was the sound of a warrior's discipline, a silence that promised a reckoning far more methodical and devastating than simple anger. Rorick had just made the gravest mistake of his career. He had assaulted a man who had turned composure into a weapon. That slap was an insult, but it wasn't the source of the cold fire now hardening in Marcus Thorne's gut. The real wound was 20 years old, carved into his memory on a dusty hillside in a forgotten war. It was the memory of Sergeant Michael Evans, Leo's father, breathing his last in Thorne's arms. Evans wasn't just a subordinate, he was the rock of Thorne's command, a man whose laughter could cut through the tension of an imminent firefight. He was a brilliant soldier who died not from an enemy bullet, but from a faulty piece of equipment the brass had been warned about for months. A compromised armored plate. The official report, sanitized and bloodless, listed his death as a result of overwhelming enemy fire during a tactical maneuver. A lie. A clean, administrative lie that buried a hero's sacrifice under a mountain of bureaucratic cowardice. Thorne had fought it. He filed reports, gave testimony, and pushed for an investigation until a superior officer, a general with cold, political eyes, told him to stand down. "The Corps needs morale, Colonel," the general had said, "not martyrs to faulty contracts." At Evans's funeral, Thorne had stood before his grieving widow and young son, Leo. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He made a vow. A silent, unbreakable promise that he would always watch over them, that Evans's legacy of honor would not be erased by the very system he died for. For 2 decades, he had kept that vow. He'd sent money, written letters, and served as a distant but constant father figure to Leo. When he heard Leo had been arrested by a notoriously aggressive cop on trumped-up charges, Thorne flew to Charleston without a second thought. He was there not as a spectator, but as a sentinel. So when Rorick's hand struck his face, it wasn't just personal. It was a desecration. The officer's casual brutality, the system's indifferent cruelty toward Leo, it was all the same beast that had swallowed his friend's truth. It was the arrogance of power that believed it could write its own reality over the bodies and honor of good men. Thorne's mission had just been updated. It was no longer just about saving Leo. It was about dismantling the machine. The day after the hearing, Thorne didn't file a complaint. He opened a campaign. From a small, rented office that smelled of old books, he began his reconnaissance. He operated not as a victim, but as an intelligence officer mapping an enemy's territory. He obtained a copy of Leo's arrest report, and his trained eye immediately spotted the tactical flaws. The timeline was a mess. Rourke claimed he'd observed Leo for 10 minutes before the arrest, but security camera footage from a nearby store, which Thorne acquired through an old contact in private security, showed Rourke's patrol car arriving only 90 seconds before the arrest was made. The report mentioned Leo was verbally non-compliant, but the footage had no audio, and the boy's posture was submissive, almost fearful. It was a sloppily constructed fiction. The turning point came from an unexpected quarter. An encrypted email appeared in his inbox. The sender ID was anonymous, the message brief: "I saw what he did to you. I'm a clerk at the courthouse. My father was a Marine, 2nd Battalion. Rourke is a cancer here. There are others." This was Malik, the young court clerk who had flinched during the slap. He was a digital native with a conscience. Over the next 48 hours, communicating through a secure channel Thorne set up, Malik became his inside source. He sent scans of other reports filed by Rourke, all involving young black men, all with suspiciously similar language: suspect displayed furtive movements, resisted verbal commands, camera malfunction during transport. It was a template for institutionalized prejudice. The most damning piece of evidence was a copy of the signature log for juvenile detentions. Malik highlighted Leo's signature on the waiver of counsel form. "Look at the L," he wrote. "It's too clean. Leo's a lefty. His L is always hooked." Thorne didn't need to be a handwriting expert. He was a man who'd studied forged documents in counterintelligence. It was a forgery. Thorne cross-referenced the names from Malik's files with public records, building a network map. A pattern emerged, clear as a battle plan. This wasn't about one bad cop. This was a coordinated operation. And every operation has a commander. Officer Rourke was a brutal instrument, but instruments don't play themselves. Thorne knew he had to find the conductor. His investigation, amplified by Malik's intel, led him away from the patrol car and into the polished offices of the city's elite. The name that kept surfacing in hushed tones and redacted files was Police Chief Elliot Granger. On the surface, Granger was the city's pride. A charismatic leader who gave speeches about community policing and had a handshake for every camera. But in the internal documents Malik leaked, Granger was a different man. He was the one who had personally signed off on the creation of the Rapid Response Unit, the official name for Rourke's crew. He was the one who consistently blocked internal affairs complaints against its members, citing insufficient evidence. Thorne, using his veteran network, connected with a retired city financial auditor. The man, a former Navy quartermaster, spoke to Thorne with the grim frankness of one service member to another. "Granger's a master of the clean budget," the auditor explained over a secure line. "He gets huge grants for at-risk youth outreach, but the money is funneled into discretionary enforcement funds. The Rapid Response Unit is his private army, funded by money meant to help the very kids they target." This was the key. Granger wasn't just a protector, he was the architect. He had created a system that allowed men like Rourke to operate with impunity, sanitizing their actions with bureaucratic language and burying their victims in paperwork. The unit's purpose was to keep the city's statistics clean and its property values high by preemptively removing anyone who didn't fit the desired demographic. They weren't peacekeepers, they were social landscapers. Thorne felt a familiar, cold dread. It was the same logic that led to his friend Evans's death, a system protecting itself at the cost of human lives and honor. Granger wasn't just covering for a bad cop, he was running a long-term, low-intensity campaign against his own citizens. And like any commanding officer, Thorne knew you couldn't win a war by just taking out the soldiers. You had to cut off the head. The moment Thorne's lawyer filed a formal request for the Rapid Response Unit's operational records, the system struck back. The war went from strategic analysis to active engagement. It began subtly. The hotel where Thorne was staying suddenly had a plumbing issue on his floor, forcing him to relocate. A black sedan with no plates was parked across from his new room for 6 hours straight. These were classic, low-level intimidation tactics, designed to unnerve. For Thorne, it was just noise. He'd slept through artillery barrages. A parked car wasn't going to disrupt his focus. The real attack was more insidious. An anonymous tip was leaked to a local conservative blogger, a known ally of the police department. The post, titled "Disgraced Soldier's Vendetta Against Police Hero," hinted that a certain retired military officer had a history of insubordination and was dishonorably discharged. It was a complete fabrication, but the lie was out there, designed to poison the well and attack the source of Thorne's authority, his honor. Next, they targeted his allies. Malik was abruptly reassigned to a windowless basement office, tasked with digitizing archived property deeds from the 19th century, a move designed to isolate him. A message was left on his car windshield, a single, dead bird. The most brutal blow was aimed at another potential witness, a woman who had previously filed a complaint against Roerich. Her son, a high school athlete, was suddenly cut from the basketball team after an anonymous tip to the school board about his poor attitude. It was a quiet, vicious message: "We can reach your family." Thorne recognized the strategy. It was a textbook counterinsurgency campaign: isolate the leader, terrorize his support base, and control the narrative. But Granger and Roerich made a critical error. They were treating Thorne like a civilian activist. They didn't understand they were fighting a man who had spent his life in the shadows, a man who knew that every attack, every threat, was a confession of fear. He logged each incident, not as a setback, but as another piece of ammunition. The enemy was showing its hand, and Colonel Thorne was preparing to call their bluff. Malik's final, most courageous data drop contained the heart of the darkness, a folder labeled Internal Resolutions _27. It contained the files of 27 young black men who had been arrested by Roerich's unit over 3 years. None were convicted of a serious crime. All their cases were quietly dismissed or pleaded down, but not before they had spent time in detention, been intimidated, and had a permanent mark placed on their records. They were ghosts in the system. As Thorne read through the files, the names and faces blurred into one. He wasn't looking at a list of victims. In his mind, he saw a platoon, ambushed and left for dead on friendly territory, their identities stripped, their stories buried. His mission crystallized. He had to bring his men home. He started with one name, Jamal, a 19-year-old working 2 jobs to support his mother. Thorne found him not through official channels, but through a pastor in his neighborhood. When Thorne sat down with him, Jamal was defensive, his eyes full of a weary distrust he was too young to have earned. "I don't talk to cops," Jamal said flatly. "I'm not a cop," Thorne replied, his voice calm and even. "I'm a Marine. And I'm here because what happened to you was an enemy action." That phrase, enemy action, broke through the boy's armor. For the first time, someone had named his experience not as a legal problem, but as an act of war. Jamal's story tumbled out, a mirror of Leo's. Over the next week, Thorne and the pastor methodically located 5 more young men from the list. He gathered them in the dusty back room of the pastor's church. He didn't ask them to relive their trauma. He laid out a large map of the city on a table. "This is the area of operations," he began, his voice taking on the familiar cadence of a briefing. "You were not random targets. You were selected. This was a systematic campaign. He showed them the patterns, the timing, the way their arrests coincided with property developments or city council meetings. He gave them language, military language, to understand what had been done to them. They weren't delinquents, they were casualties. They weren't forgotten, they were a unit. As they listened, their fear and shame began to transform into a cold, focused anger. They were no longer scattered victims. They were soldiers in Thorne's forgotten platoon, and they were finally ready to fight back. The system's final move was to sue him. Chief Granger, using a proxy civil liberties group he funded, filed a lawsuit against Thorne for harassment and illegal use of sealed documents, aiming to bury him in legal fees and discredit him as a rogue agent. It was a declaration of total war. Thorne's response was to seize the narrative. He didn't hire a PR firm. He set up a laptop in his Spartan office, a map of Charleston dotted with red pins on the wall behind him, and scheduled a live YouTube broadcast. He titled it simply, Briefing on Operation Restore Honor. At 8 p.m., he went live. Dressed in his Marine Corps dress blues, his chest a solid block of medals and ribbons, he was no longer a quiet man in a tweed jacket. He was Colonel Marcus Thorne, and he was taking command. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm, powerful, and utterly devoid of emotion. "For the last 6 weeks, I have been conducting an intelligence operation in this city. My objective, to identify and neutralize a hostile element operating within the Charleston Police Department." What followed was not a plea for sympathy. It was a devastatingly precise military briefing. He presented the evidence in numbered slides. Exhibit A, timeline discrepancy in the arrest of civilian minor, Leo Evans. Exhibit B, forged signature on waiver of counsel. He played audio of Rorick's racist tirades, showed the data map of the forgotten platoon's arrests, and displayed Granger's laundered budget documents. He never raised his voice. He simply presented facts, connecting the dots with cold, irrefutable logic. The live chat, initially filled with trolls and police supporters, fell silent, then exploded with messages of support from veterans across the country. "Ora, Colonel. We see you, sir. Got your 6. His closing was short and brutal. "Chief Granger has declared I am a threat to this city's stability. He is correct. I am a threat to his stability. The stability of corruption. The stability of dishonor." He looked directly into the camera, his eyes like polished steel. "This is not a protest. This is a counteroffensive. And we will not stand down. Over and out." The screen went black. The broadcast shattered the city's carefully constructed silence. It went viral, amplified by a nationwide network of veterans who recognized one of their own under fire. National media, smelling blood, descended on Charleston. Granger's wall of deniability crumbled in less than 48 hours. The mayor demanded his resignation. The Department of Justice announced a full-scale federal investigation into the department. Rorick was suspended, then fired. It was a swift, decisive victory. A week later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the Arlington National Cemetery. Colonel Thorne stood before a simple white headstone that read, Mikey Evans, Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps, a husband, a father, a hero. Beside him stood Leo, no longer a scared kid in a jumpsuit, but a young man with a newfound straightness to his spine. Thorne reached into his jacket, pulled out the silver star he had earned in the same operation where Evans fell, and gently placed it at the base of the tombstone. It glinted in the sunlight. "Mission complete, Mikey," Thorne whispered, his voice thick with emotion for the first time. No one left behind. He knew this battle was won, but the war for honor was never truly over. It was fought every day, in every city, by those who refused to let silence be the final word. Honor isn't just for the battlefield, it's for every day. What does standing for justice mean to you? Share your story and comment, honor, to stand with those who defend it. Subscribe for more true stories of courage.